when Europe bound Venezuela and America changed forever. It was December 13th, 1902, and the Caribbean sun was burning hard over Puerto Cabello Harbor. The old Spanish fort stood exactly where it always had, cracked and sun-bleached against the turquoise sea. Children played near the docks. Fishermen pulled in their nets like any other afternoon. Then the horizon moved. What everyone remembers about this day is the bombardment, the thunder of British and German naval guns splitting open the Venezuelan sky, the fire, the smoke, and the crumbling stone walls of a fort that had survived centuries. But here is what they don't teach you in any classroom. Those guns were not fired over politics. They were not fired over land, ideology, or religion. They were fired over a ledger, a balance sheet with ink that had turned blood red. This was not a war. It was a foreclosure with artillery. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful empires on earth didn't send their warships because they feared Venezuela. They sent them because Venezuela owed them money and refused to pay. Every cannon blast that afternoon was a collection notice written in fire and steel. The real weapon was not iron or gunpowder. The real weapon was compound interest. And that debt, that rotting mountain of obligation, didn't just destroy Venezuelan cities. It changed the entire architecture of the Western world forever. To understand what happened on that burning afternoon, you have to understand what Venezuela once looked like on paper. In the mid-1800s, Venezuela was a nation full of spectacular potential. Its coastlines were vast. Its rivers cut deep into fertile lowlands, bursting with coffee, cocoa, and tropical timber. European investors looked at Venezuela and saw a gold mine wrapped in jungle. Banks in London, Frankfurt, and Rome lined up eagerly to pour money into the country. Between 1850 and 1895, Venezuela signed loan after loan with European creditors, totaling over 350 million bolivars. Railways were promised. Ports were to be modernized. Telegraph lines were to stretch across the mountains. Foreign engineers arrived with blueprints. German merchants built warehouses along the docks. British ranchers bought enormous cattle estates deep in the interior. The whole enterprise shimmered with the illusion of prosperity. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Venezuela was not a functioning republic. It was a battlefield wearing the costume of a republic. In the 70 years after independence, the country suffered 52 separate revolts, coups, and civil wars. Each new strongman who clawed his way to Caracas found the presidential palace stripped bare. The treasury was always empty. The infrastructure built on foreign loans was always the first thing destroyed when the shooting started. The railways were bombed. The ports were blockaded by rival factions. The German warehouses were looted. The British cattle were stolen or slaughtered. And all the while, the interest on those European loans kept compounding silently. It never stopped. It never forgave. The ledger grew heavier every single year. By 1899, a man named Cipriano Castro had seized power. He rode into Caracas from the mountains with 60 men and a thunderous belief in his own greatness. He dressed like a general from a Victor Hugo novel and talked like a prophet. He called himself the Napoleon of the Andes. He had fire and fury in enormous supply. What he did not have was a single functioning peso in the national treasury. Venezuela's balance sheet in 1899 was a horror story in numbers. The country owed foreign creditors approximately 187 million bolivars in outstanding principal alone. The accumulated interest had swollen that figure beyond anything manageable. German banks held claims for looted merchant property worth over 2.4 million marks. British investors presented damages totaling nearly 1.1 million pounds sterling. Italian shipping companies had their own list of grievances stretching back 2 decades. Castro's response to all of it was magnificent in its defiance and catastrophic in its consequences. He told the Europeans in the most polite diplomatic language possible to go straight to hell. He argued that foreigners who chose to do business in Venezuela accepted Venezuelan risks. He set up a debt review commission stacked entirely with his own political allies. He suspended all foreign debt payments. He told the British ambassador with genuine pride that no foreign foot would ever desecrate the sacred soil of his fatherland. It was the kind of rhetoric that got crowds cheering. It was the kind of economics that got battleships launched. Castro had confused national dignity with national solvency. Those are not the same thing. Sovereignty is solvency, and Venezuela was bleeding out from both wounds at once. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II watched all of this with barely contained excitement. Germany was a late arrival to the imperial game. Britain, France, and the Netherlands had spent centuries carving up the world's coastlines and resources. Germany had only unified in 1871 and already felt cheated by history. The Kaiser had poured a fortune into building the Kriegsmarine, his gleaming new battle fleet. He needed somewhere to demonstrate its reach. He needed a stage. Venezuela was perfect. It was weak, isolated, and defiant. Best of all, Germany had a legitimate financial grievance. This wasn't aggression. This was debt collection. The Kaiser didn't need a pretext. He had an invoice. Germany was owed money, and the Kaiser intended to collect it the way only a man with a fleet of armored cruisers could. London was more reluctant, but the math was the same. British investors were screaming at Parliament about their losses. The British Empire's entire global financial system rested on the credibility of contract enforcement. If a small South American dictator could simply refuse to pay a British bank and face no consequences, the implications were terrifying. What would happen in Egypt? What would happen in India? The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency because everyone believed Britain would always collect what it was owed. That belief had a price. The price in December of 1902 was a joint naval operation with the Germans, an unholy alliance. 2 rival empires joining hands over a shared invoice. The Iron Alliance, as the papers called it. It was a partnership built entirely on the logic of a balance sheet. On December 7, 1902, the British and German ambassadors delivered a joint ultimatum to Caracas. Pay up within 24 hours. Cover the outstanding debts. Compensate the foreign nationals. Open the customs houses to international supervision. Castro read the ultimatum and did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. He believed the United States would protect him. He had built his entire strategic calculation around the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which forbade European powers from intervening in the Americas. He was certain that Theodore Roosevelt would send the American Navy south to stand between him and the Europeans. He was certain Uncle Sam was his shield. He was dangerously, catastrophically wrong, because Theodore Roosevelt despised Cipriano Castro personally. Roosevelt had privately described Castro as a contemptible little monkey. He believed Castro's reckless financial behavior was an embarrassment to the hemisphere. When the German ambassador had quietly asked Roosevelt months earlier whether Washington would object to a Venezuelan blockade, Roosevelt had said no. He told the Europeans they could punish Venezuela as long as they took no land. Roosevelt thought he was managing the situation. He thought he was being clever. He had handed the Kaiser a leash and assumed the Kaiser would use it like a gentleman. He was wrong about that, too. When the 24 hours expired with no response from Caracas, the European fleet moved. On December 9, 1902, British and German warships sailed directly into La Guaira harbor, the main port of Caracas. They didn't negotiate. They didn't wait. They sent armed boarding parties across to the Venezuelan Navy's small fleet of gunboats and converted yachts. The Venezuelan sailors were dragged off their ships at gunpoint. Then, in a display of calculated contempt that was pure psychological warfare, the Europeans towed 2 Venezuelan vessels, the Totumo and the General Crespo, out into open water. They didn't take them as prizes. They didn't sell them. They sank them. Deliberately, publicly, and slowly. The message was not subtle. Your navy doesn't exist. Your sovereignty doesn't exist. Pay the bill. When news of the sinking reached Caracas, the city exploded. Castro went to the balcony of the presidential palace and delivered a speech that shook windows for 3 blocks. He called on every Venezuelan to rise up against the insult. Mobs tore the German Imperial Eagle from the consulate wall and smashed it on the cobblestones. The British and German diplomatic staff had to be physically rescued from crowds that wanted to tear them apart. Castro ordered the arrest of every British and German citizen on Venezuelan soil. It was a hostage situation stretched across an entire country, and the Europeans answered with fire. On December 13, 1902, it happened. The British cruiser HMS Charybdis and the German cruiser SMS Veneta trained their guns on the ancient Castillo Libertador at Porto Cabello. The captain of a seized British merchant vessel demanded release of his ship. The Venezuelan garrison refused. The guns spoke. The bombardment lasted just long enough to turn the old fort into rubble and the customs building into smoking debris. Civilian homes were caught in the crossfire. The port, which had handled over 40 million bolivars in trade annually, was shut completely. The blockade was total. British and German ships formed an iron ring around the entire Venezuelan coastline. No coffee out. No food in. No medicine in. Venezuela's customs revenue, which represented 90% of all government income, dropped to zero overnight. The balance sheet was now not just broken. It was incinerated. The American press erupted. Newspapers ran front-page illustrations of the German Kaiser dressed as a pirate, pointing cannons at a weeping woman labeled South America. The American public, which had watched the whole drama unfold with mild curiosity, began to feel something darker, anger. This was a monarchy shelling a republic over a debt. Every American who had ever read a school book about the Revolution felt the old instinct flare up. Kings don't get to shell republics. Not in this hemisphere. Admiral George Dewey, the hero of Manila Bay, was commanding an enormous U.S. naval fleet in Puerto Rico. His fleet was larger than the combined European squadron. It was sitting there, coal bunkers full, engines ready. The sleeping giant was not sleeping. Not sleeping. It was watching. Then Italy joined the blockade. Seeing that Germany and Britain were about to get paid, Rome sent its own warships south, demanding a share of Venezuelan debt. 3 European empires were now strangling one bankrupt Caribbean republic. It was a feeding frenzy, and then the Germans pushed too far. The German gunboat SMS Panther tried to force passage into Lake Maracaibo to shell the city and seize the coal mines near the shore. The Panther ran aground on a sandbar in early January of 1903, stuck, vulnerable, and humiliated. The Venezuelan gunners at Fort San Carlos opened fire. They hit the Panther several times and forced her to limp away in retreat. It was a small and glorious moment. It did not last. The Kaiser was furious. On January 17, 1903, the Panther returned with the heavy cruiser SMC Veneta beside her. They didn't just attack the fort this time. They fired incendiary shells directly into the village of San Carlos. The wooden buildings caught fire like paper. Dozens of civilians burned or were buried in rubble. The massacre of San Carlos was the moment the debt collection story became a war crime story. The American press used the phrase "baby killers" in banner headlines. Roosevelt read the intelligence reports in the White House with a jaw made of stone. This was not the manageable spanking he had authorized. This was a European empire burning Latin American villages for sport. Roosevelt summoned the German ambassador, a diplomat named Theodor von Halleben, to a private meeting that was deliberately kept off the official logs. The conversation that followed was one of the most consequential in American diplomatic history. Roosevelt told von Halleben, in language carefully stripped of all warmth, that the United States would not tolerate any permanent European presence in Venezuelan territory. He demanded that Germany accept international arbitration immediately. He stated with cold precision that if Germany had not agreed within 10 days, he would order Admiral Dewey's entire Atlantic fleet to steam south and physically break the blockade. It was a threat of open war between the United States and Germany. The ambassador was white. He protested. He argued. Roosevelt simply looked at him and said he would reduce the deadline to 24 hours if the answer wasn't fast enough. The German ambassador sent panicked cables to Berlin overnight. The Kaiser read them at his palace and felt the air go out of the room. Germany was powerful. Germany's navy was growing and gleaming and modern, but it was not ready to fight the United States Navy on American soil. Its supply lines across the Atlantic were impossibly long. It had no bases in the Caribbean. Admiral Dewey's fleet was already there, already fueled, already pointed south. The German Admiralty ran the numbers quietly. The numbers said retreat. The Iron Alliance cracked like ice in warm water. Britain told Berlin it would not fight America over Venezuelan invoices. Not over this. The great unified front of European creditors dissolved in a weekend. On the eve of Roosevelt's deadline, von Halleben returned to the White House. He told the president that the Kaiser accepted arbitration. The blockade was lifted in February of 1903. The case went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague in the Netherlands. The legal proceedings were civil, orderly, and devastating. The court ruled that Britain, Germany, and Italy, as the nations that had actually deployed military force to enforce the debt, deserved preferential payment over all other creditors. They went to the front of the line because they had bombed someone. Let that sink in. The world's most prestigious international court had just ruled that gunboat diplomacy worked. That violence accelerated payment. That if you wanted your money back faster, the The fastest tool available was a naval squadron. It was a ruling that made every lawyer in Europe reach for a pen and every banker in London reach for a map. Latin America heard that ruling and went cold with fear. Every fragile republic south of the Rio Grande suddenly understood its position. Any European creditor with a grievance and a willing government could legally justify an invasion. Any default, any disputed contract, any looted warehouse could become a pretext for occupation. An Argentine diplomat named Luis Drago articulated what everyone was feeling in a doctrine that now bears his name. He argued that sovereign debt can never be a legal justification for armed intervention, that when investors lend money to a nation, they accept the risk of that nation, that a default is a financial event, not a military one. The Drago doctrine was eloquent, principled, and largely ignored by the great powers in 1903. Theodore Roosevelt drew his own conclusion, and it was far more brutal. He looked at the chaos Venezuela had produced. He looked at the Hague ruling. He looked at the German Kaiser's willingness to burn villages over invoice disputes. And he did the arithmetic. The Monroe Doctrine told Europe to stay out of the Americas, but it said nothing about what happened when an American country couldn't pay its bills and invited European gunboats through sheer financial incompetence. The loophole was enormous. The only way to close it was to eliminate the need for European intervention entirely. If the Americans handled all Latin American debt enforcement themselves, the Europeans would have no pretext to send a single ship. America would become the collection agency, not the debtor's friend, the hemisphere's financial enforcer. In December of 1904, in his annual message to Congress, Roosevelt unveiled the policy that would define American foreign relations for the next century. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The language was measured and presidential. The meaning was imperial and absolute. He stated that chronic wrongdoing or financial impotence in a neighboring nation might require intervention by a civilized power. He stated that in the Western Hemisphere, the United States would exercise that international police power. Translation was simple. If you can't pay your debts, the Marines will come. They will take your customs house, they will balance your books, they will pay your creditors, and they will stay until they decide to leave. The consequences arrived almost immediately. In 1905, the United States seized control of the Dominican Republic's customs revenue. In 1915, Marines landed in Haiti and would not leave for 19 years. Nicaragua hosted American troops on and off for 2 full decades. Cuba fell under American financial supervision. In each country, the pattern was the same. Insolvency first, intervention second. American flags over the Treasury third. The Venezuela Crisis of 1902 was not the beginning of American empire, but it was the moment that empire became policy, written down, signed, publicly announced. The ledger of one bankrupt Caribbean nation had created the doctrine that shaped an entire century. Cipriano Castro survived the blockade, but not for long. His health collapsed in 1908, and he made the catastrophic decision to travel to Berlin for surgery, leaving his vice president, Juan Vicente Gomez, in charge of Caracas. While Castro was unconscious on a German operating table, Gomez moved. He contacted Washington. He promised order, debt repayment, and opened doors for American investment. The United States Navy stationed warships off the Venezuelan coast to physically prevent Castro from returning by sea.